Good afternoon. My name is Jensen. I'm an affiliate researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Bryn Mawr College. I just have to say that nothing I'm saying today is necessarily representative of the positions or opinions of any of my current or former employers. We all know that climate change effects are myriad. There's everything from coastal erosion through other hydrological changes, changes in fire regimes, changing land cover. None of it has proven to be good for cultural heritage. We know that there's big impacts. Here's just a few of the more important sites that are within 20 miles of where I live, Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow. Here's Nuvuk, the tip of the North American continent. This is eroding rapidly. Here's Pechanik, which is the Burnok National Historic Landmark. You can see that sea level is rising here, encroaching on house mounds. There's also some issues with erosion from the other side. And here you can see the more recent duck camp that's still part of the site. Here's a Cooksey. This mound used to be big enough for an entire community to hold a whaling celebration on top of. There were probably only 200 or so people in town at the time, but still, obviously it's not big enough for that now. And here's Walakpa, which is a fairly well-known stratified site near south of town. It's the only site at least in the Alaskan Arctic, that has a stratified sequence running all the way from the Arctic small tool tradition to modern Inupiat people. In 2012, everything looked like this. There was no erosion. In June 2013, everything looked like this. And then this happened. Here you can see part of a house. And within a year after a big storm, it looked like this. It may not look like things got a lot worse, but in fact, the coastline retreated 30 meters, and it took 30 meters of the site along about a 500-meter front out, just completely vanished. But here's the thing that's really come to me when I was working on this paper. I was running into it a lot of reasons, on a lot of other things I was working on. And critical infrastructure in the community is suffering many of the same impacts. It's not just cultural heritage. And that brings with it a whole host of perhaps second order problems. So the next few slides are from a site called the Barrow Area Information Database. And basically they've georectified a series of aerial and satellite photographs from a number of different years, and you can actually pick your 2 years and slide back and forth. So what I've done is screen grabs of the sliders. So this is a 1948 or 1949 Barrow. And you can see its coastline's pretty unmodified. There's this pretty good beach. This is 2014, which unfortunately is the latest set that they've got in there so far. I think that they are hoping to get another set in, but you can see that the beach is much narrower in many places, and there's been a lot of modifications. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit. We have here a house. It is, as you can perhaps see, parallel to the coastline. It's built by a good friend of the family's, George Levitt. And in 1986, there was a large storm, and it caused some severe erosion along here, and it took out the land and the pilings under the back half of George's house. Now, fortunately, George was an excellent builder, and so his house didn't fall apart. They were actually able to put straps on it, the kind they used to pull whales up on the ice, and put some pilings in what used to be the front yard really quickly, and actually turn the house 90 degrees and move it on to the new pilings. So his house is still there and still in use, although George is now passed on. But this is where the house used to be. Most of that's thin air. The big oval here is just a place in the road where you can see in the past there was just a road, no problem. Here you can see a big line of sandbags, which is really the only thing keeping the ocean off the road. And as a matter of fact, now in 2019, these have been damaged additionally, had to be replaced many times, and the road has suffered so much flooding that basically the road itself has deteriorated into more or less mud. This doesn't look too bad. Here's lots of shore protection. You can see that there's an archaeological site in front of this house. This is actually one of George's relatives' house. There's a eroding house mound. Here's another one. It looks okay. Now we're going up on top of the bluff, and this is the same house, same year. Obviously, things aren't as okay as they look from the beach. There's probably less than 2 meters between this piling and this crack. And once that's gone, this house is going to be in the same position. It's not clear that they built quite as well as George. And you can see that there's a number of other buildings all the way along this coastline, including a number of apartment buildings, including a store and I mean, it's in a fabric shop, which is really important to the town for making, because a lot of people still make their own clothing. All of that's just out there at risk. Here on the right is another kind of infrastructure. It's the remains of an ice cellar. People actually constructed ice cellars, often actually in archaeological sites, because the matrix is held together quite well by marine mammal oil, so it actually is easier to work with than the loose gravels and sands and silts that otherwise exist. So there, it's easier to dig a hole and have it stay open. Although the main deal there is permafrost. But this cellar has obviously pretty much gone, and hopefully they were able to replace it. But ice cellars are having more and more trouble as climate changes. Here is the road that you can see that down here it's already has suffered a lot of overwash, and it's got standing ponded water, and that the guardrail is not too far away from these houses. These are big apartment buildings, and this is the only access. They back up to other buildings. There are no alleys through. You have to get down here by this road. The problem is that, as you can see, this road is in even worse shape now. And this is actually a couple years old, so it's probably even worse now. But you can see that the guardrail is completely eroded. You can also see that these structures are sitting on top of an archaeological site. Here's midden, all the way over to here. There's some more over here. There's also ice wedges under here that are melting out. And this is fill. Now, building your house on top of a previous house or on top of an archaeological site is an old tradition. Probably a couple thousand years at least this has been going on. And in fact, by building your house where an old house had been abandoned, you often had a better building site the next time around. There was more sod available to cover your house. The ground was a little higher, so it was going to be better drained. No disadvantages. However, when they decided to try to build modern surface entrance houses and they put in roads because people were starting to get vehicles and so on and so forth, what they did was get a whole lot of material, much of it dredged, I believe, and just basically level the ground surface. So where there was mounds, there's not a lot of fill. Where there wasn't a mound, so in between the different mounds, there's a lot more fill. But basically, you can't really get at these sites unless things erode. And there've been lots of attempts, as you can see, to try and stop the coastal erosion, but it hasn't really happened. Moving a little bit north, here's two sites associated with Charles DeWitt Brower, who was a famous Yankee whaler who moved up to Barrow, married a local lady, and never left. This was his house. Here it is in the red. You can see there used to be a lot more land out in front of it. And this is a building that is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was originally a whalers refuge station, which Charlie Brower bought from the government, turned into his trading post, and then later it became a restaurant when the trading post moved over this way. There's actually been considerable erosion here as well since this last picture. And here's a road called Stevenson Street, which ran all the way out past the picnic site, the Burnham site, And actually, there's a not as well-traveled part of it that goes way out to a boat launch. These are used to put, aside from people trying to get to and from their subsistence cabins and to go subsistence hunting out here, people put boats into Elson Lagoon and travel to the east. There's a lot of people who have subsistence cabins 20, 30, 40 miles away up some rivers, which is much better caribou hunting country. And so they go over there, and their families have for generations. And if it's much better to go in the lagoon, the water's much more protected. If you put in on this side, you have to go around and go through an entrance, which can be quite exciting under certain conditions, particularly in a small boat. And by quite exciting, I mean you could die. So obviously the boat launches into the lagoon are fairly important infrastructure, not to say critical. But unfortunately, in our latest storm-driven disaster, this road was destroyed. It's been getting affected, and the coast has been creeping in, and the North Slope Borough, which is the municipal government, has been spending, $1 million or so a year trying to fix it. But this go round, it just was too awful. So now people actually have to kind of drive through here, and they can only do it if they have four-wheel drive vehicles with big clearances. So here, this outline is the National Historic Landmark, which is the next step down from World Heritage Site in the US system. Well, so here's a balancing act between how do you preserve critical infrastructure services for people, which you have to do. I mean, people need to have places to live. They need to be able to access food and water and travel and shelter, as well as preserving cultural heritage. And why is it such a balancing act? Well, much of the infrastructure in this town is built on top of archaeological sites. So there's no way to build protection for the infrastructure without directly impacting the site. So for example, some of those places I showed you earlier, one of the current thoughts is to build a large revetment leaning up against the archaeological site. So site surface here, revetment here. How they're going to do that, not clear yet. And if they're building that, obviously you're not going to be able to access the site for research. So there's very limited opportunities for documentation here. We don't have a wide beach, so there's no way to set up and do, LiDAR scanning and so on and so forth. We have very short construction seasons, so people, when the snow's off, so you can actually see it, people want to be building. They don't want to get out of the way for archaeologists. And there's also the risk of catastrophic collapse. The former location of the infrastructure is gone in some cases, so you can't build back there. And people like to have their cabins where they are. They don't want to move, especially they do not want to move away from the ocean. These are marine mammal hunting people, and they want to be able to see the ocean. So in those cases, often the only place to relocate affects the site. So either a revetment up against the site or roads on berms next to or through a site. This is a plan. This is one attempt at trying to thread a road past the Berners site. And aside from the fact that it hit a lot of these cabins, which people were very much against, this is the center, this stake is the center line of the road. This that I'm going around is the outline of a previously unknown mound, which is presumably part of the site and part of the National Historic Landmark. We did GPR, and there is indeed structure under it. So federal laws basically will only let us put things back if there's minimal risk of a repeat occurrence of whatever damage. Otherwise, something else has to happen. And in any event, avoidance, cultural resources have to be considered when they're doing federal funding. They prefer to avoid them, but otherwise you have to mitigate. And so one of the things that's been discussed, in how to respond to these things, aside from alternative mitigation by excavation at some place that isn't going to be impacted by the actual construction, is in some cases, can you consider the protection that building the revetments or the berms or whatever is going to provide from the site? In other words, keeping it from eroding, keeping it from having saltwater incursion, whatever, be considered part of a mitigation. So if the impact is visual, a site can no longer see the ocean, but it can't see the ocean because of something that's going to keep the ocean from washing it away in fairly short order. Can that be a mitigation? There's a fair bit of discussion been going on about that. I'm very interested in learning what other people may have run into along this line, because I can't imagine we're the only place where there isn't major impact on critical infrastructure from climate change, and how people have actually resolved those questions. Thank you very much, and